exploding! Get out of here!
Run! She was the most powerful woman on earth. A ruler draped in velvet and pearls, crowned by God and feared by kings. But behind the throne, beneath the ruff, and under layers of white powder, something far more tragic was unfolding. Something so eerie, so quietly grotesque, that few dared to speak of it until centuries later. This is not the story of Queen Elizabeth I, as told in textbooks or oil paintings. This is the story of the body beneath the myth, the slow, silent unraveling of a woman who became immortal, but only because she was already dying on the inside. From the moment she took the throne in the year 1558, Elizabeth Tudor understood that her body was no longer her own. It was a symbol, a weapon, a living piece of propaganda to be polished, framed, and never allowed to change. The image of the Virgin Queen, the flawless white face, the blazing red hair, the eternal youth was not born from vanity. It was born from survival. She had inherited a throne soaked in blood. Her mother had been beheaded. Her sister had burned heretics. Her father had shattered an entire religion just to produce a male heir, Elizabeth. Lacking armies or husbands, had only one tool to hold power herself, and so she began to construct a face the world could worship. But what she used to build it would eventually destroy her. After surviving a brutal case of smallpox at the age of 29, the Queen's face was left scarred, her once smooth skin forever marked by the disease. In a court obsessed with appearances, where a single blemish could unravel alliances, Elizabeth made a fateful choice. She turned to a substance known as Venetian ceruse, a thick white paint made from vinegar and white lead. Each morning, her attendants would grind it fresh, mixing the paste until it was smooth as bone, then spread it across her face in layer after layer. This mask hid every imperfection. It also poisoned her slowly. Lead seeped into the bloodstream with every application. Over the years, it caused muscle weakness, trembling, insomnia, and hair loss. The more it damaged her skin, the more she needed to wear it. It flaked. It cracked. It turned her into a ghost. And yet she welcomed it. She had become addicted not only to the appearance of perfection, but to the power it brought her. In portrait, she was untouched by time. In court, she was divine. But when the mirrors were covered and the candles snuffed out, her ladies-in-waiting saw something else entirely. Her hair thinned to patches. Her teeth blackened and fell. Her breath soured. Her nails turned brittle and grey. She could not sleep. She forgot names. Her skin blistered beneath the paint. But still she demanded more. Cinnabar on the lips, mercury in the eye makeup, arsenic to remove dark spots. By the final decade of her reign, Elizabeth was a walking apothecary of slow death, and yet no one dared to stop her. For to question her appearance was to question the crown itself. Physicians were summoned, of course, but even they knew better than to speak the full truth. When her health declined sharply in the early spring of the year 1603, whispers of madness began to spread. She refused to eat. She refused to sleep. She refused to lie down, even when her legs buckled beneath her. For 15 hours, she stood upright in her chambers, propped by pillows, draped in heavy gowns, her crown still gleaming as though the act of lying down would make death real. The ring she had worn since her coronation had grown into her skin. It could no longer be removed without surgery. The flesh around it had swollen, infected, refusing to yield. And still, she insisted it remain on her hand. It was said the removal of the ring hastened her death, that the wound it left behind became the gateway through which all her suffering spilled into the body. But perhaps the most chilling part of this story came after she died. Her body, embalmed quickly and poorly, was placed in a sealed casket for transport and display. But inside that casket, something horrific occurred. One of her ladies later claimed the Queen's body exploded, whether from natural gases, pressure buildup, or the chemical cocktail inside her skin, reacting with embalming fluid. We may never know. But the myth endured, as myths often do when they come too close to the truth. The woman who had ruled England for 44 years, who had defeated the Spanish Armada, who had been courted by kings and worshipped by poets, ended not in glory but in rupture. Her body, like hair rain, had reached its final tension point and torn open. And yet, there is something painfully poetic in this ending. Elizabeth I lived as a symbol. She ruled as an icon. She held herself together with poison and performance. And in the end, her body could no longer bear the burden of both. This is the tale that rarely gets told in history books. The tale of a queen who conquered her enemies, but could not outrun her own reflection. In the final days of winter, when the wind scraped against the palace walls like dry bone over stone, the queen awoke in silence. She had not dreamed, or if she had, she would not say. Her chambermaids interred quietly, their faces turned away, their footsteps muffled by layers of wool and obedience. Elizabeth sat stiffly on the edge of her bed, upright, not from strength, but from a fear so deeply ingrained it had become muscle memory. To lie down, truly lie down, was to surrender to gravity, to decay, to the one truth she had denied for over 4 decades, that even queens must die. But this morning was like the others. Ritual would conceal reality. Her maids began with the oils infused with lavender, wormwood, and bitter orange peel meant to soothe the cracking skin around her temples. The cracks had deepened over the past few months, lengthening into thin white valleys that makeup could no longer hide without burning. She winced as the mixture was pressed into her skin, but said nothing. A queen does not flinch, not before the mirror, not before God. The ceruse came next. It was mixed fresh each morning. White lead, ground into powder and blended with vinegar until it resembled milk turned sour in a silver bowl. The maid stirred it with a bone-handled spatula, the same one they had used for years. Its tip stained a faint grey that would never wash away. Elizabeth reached for the jar herself this time, dismissing the girl with a flick of her hand. Her fingers, once praised for their grace, now trembled slightly, not from age, not entirely, but from the accumulation of years steeped in poison. Still, she dipped 2 fingers into the thick paste and began to paint herself, over the ridges of her cheeks, over the sunken slope of her nose, into the hollows beneath her eyes, where shadows had begun to gather like mourning birds. With every pass, she erased another layer of truth. And yet the mirror remained. It stood before her, tall and silver, framed in ivory and carved with vines that curled like questions. For decades, she had stared into it, perfecting the mask, checking for cracks in the illusion. But now, she hesitated. The queen had begun to fear her own reflection, for in the stillness of those long nights, when the candles burned low and the courtiers slept, she had seen things there, glimpses of the mother she never knew, of the girl with fire in her hair, of the executioner's block where Anne Boleyn's life had ended and hers had begun. And now, staring back from the mirror, she saw something worse. Not a face, a skull, not death, but something that had forgotten how to die. Her lips twitched. The maid waited, silent, a touch of rouge. Then, the cinnabar was applied mercury, bright and thick as syrup, across the thinned line of her mouth. It bled into the cracks of her lips, making them burn. But she welcomed the pain. Pain meant présence. Pain reminded her she was still here, still sovereign, still feared. Outside the chamber, ministers waited. Ambassadors murmured. The nation turned on invisible wheels powered by rumour and breath. But inside the room, time moved differently. It moved backward, Elizabeth thought of when she had first begun to wear the mask. After the smallpox, after the fever broke, and the servants whispered that the Queen's skin had changed forever. She remembered the moment she first saw the scar just below the hairline. Shaped like a fallen star. She had covered it instinctively. With powder. Then more powder. Until one day, the real skin beneath had vanished entirely. She had buried herself alive. Layer by layer. And no one had noticed. And now, all these years later, her body was giving way beneath the artifice. The rash at her collarbone had spread to her shoulders. Her hair had thinned to wisps. Her memory stuttered. Misplacing names. Confusing hours. The Privy Council had begun to speak of succession. She had no heir. No child to carry her forward. Only portraits. Only rumours. Only paint. And yet she could not stop. Because if she peeled the mask away, what would remain? Would they still bow? Would they still write poems? Would the court still whisper of Gloriana? The Virgin Queen, the moon goddess, who had ruled for over 4 decades? Or would they turn away in disgust? Would they see the truth that beneath the gold and silk and crimson? She was no different than the women they accused of witchcraft. No stronger than the peasants dying of plague. No more immortal than the mothers who buried their babies in the frost. She blinked, and the mirror blinked back. Her hand hovered over the jar of powder. She wanted to stop, just for a moment, to breathe. But habit prevailed. She pressed more ceruse into her chin, sealing the cracks that had begun to bleed. A knock at the door. She did not respond. The maid adjusted the ruff around her throat. It scratched like straw. Stiffened with starch and expectation. Elizabeth stood slowly, her knees aching. Beneath the gown, her body groaned in ways she could no longer name. Her coronation ring pulsed against her swollen finger, the flesh surrounding it like a wound stitched shut by gold. She had not removed it in over 44 years. Now, it would take a knife. Outside, the court would greet her with applause, with the dull roar of protocol, with eyes trained not on her body, but on her silhouette. They would not see the bones pressing beneath the fabric. They would not smell the rot beneath the perfume. They would only see the mask, and they would be satisfied. But inside the Queen, something had begun to shift. The lead was winning. She could feel it in her breath, in the way her lungs dragged each inhale like cloth soaked in rain. She could feel it in the blackness at the edge of her vision, in the ache behind her eyes. She had read once that lead collects in the bones, that it never truly leaves, that even after death, it lingers, turning the body to chalk, a ghost before the grave. And yet she stepped forward. The doors opened. The courtiers rose, and the mask smiled, not because it wanted to, but because it had no other choice. There was a time when the world believed that the divine right of kings was not just a doctrine, but a substance, something breathed in with incense and exhaled through law, something that soaked into the velvet of the throne and laced itself into the golden thread of a royal robe. But beneath the Tudor crown, behind the pageantry of 1,000 whispered oaths and glistening court dances, there was something far more earthly pulsing through the veins of Queen Elizabeth, the slow, deliberate drip of poison, and not the kind given by cup or dagger, but the kind willingly applied, day after day, in the name of power, beauty, and myth. The truth is this: her death did not begin with illness, nor betrayal, nor time it began with a paste, a powder, a pigment. Ash morning, as the world outside the palace whispered of harvests and war, Elizabeth's chamber became a kind of alchemical theatre, where potions were stirred not by sorcerers, but by servants, and transformations occurred not with spells, but with mercury, lead, vinegar, and flame. Her beauty spoken of in sonnets, feared by rivals, and immortalized in canvas, was a delicate machinery powered by substances that even the apothecaries feared. And yet none dared question the ritual, because to speak of the Queen's appearance was to speak of her mortality. And in the England of the 16th century, Elizabeth was not a woman, she was the realm. The white paint, known by name as Venetian ceruse, was the crown's most faithful conspirator, crafted from white lead soaked in vinegar, and then dried into flakes before being crushed to a powder and mixed with aromatic oils. It promised purity and silence,
I am not
a face untouched by flaw or time. It did more than conceal. It erased, it turned the Queen into a marble sculpture. Smooth, inhuman, cold to the eye, but lead, as the learned physicians had begun to understand, was no innocent guest. It seeped through the pores, travelled through the blood, and buried itself in the brain. It stole appetite, unravelled thought, and turned hair to ash. Yet still she wore it, not in ignorance, but in necessity. To appear as anything less was to appear as a woman. And a woman, even on a throne, was still a body to be judged. But the poison did not stop at her cheeks. Rouge, for the lips, came from cinnabar, a scarlet pigment rich in mercury sulfide, mined in caverns where miners seldom returned whole. Mercury is a trickster of a metal, quicksilver in name and temperament, and it danced across the Queen's skin like fire, sinking into the tissue beneath, stirring tremors, confusion, and unsteady breath. It gave her lips the hue of youth, even as it took her clarity. Her eyes, rimmed in kohl, flickered like lanterns in fog, and yet those who saw her in private whispered of moments where she did not recognize familiar faces, where she turned away from her own reflection, as if glimpsing a stranger's ghost. But all of it, the lead, the mercury, the endless layers of perfume meant to smother the scent of decay, was accepted because it served the greater illusion that the Queen was unchanging, untouched by death, a creature who had stepped outside of nature's cycle and into a realm of eternal command. No illness could be admitted, nor decline acknowledged. When her teeth loosened, her speech was softened. When her breath grew shallow, her maids fanned the air as if it were heat alone. And when her fingertips grew blue with slowed circulation, the gloves were lengthened, the sleeves extended, the gowns made heavier. They called her Gloriana, the fairy queen. Astrea returned to earth to bring order and peace. But beneath the poems, the portraits, the courtly masks, there lay a woman who could not sleep, whose joints ached, whose temples throbbed with invisible pressure, and who, for all her might, could not stop the pain crawling beneath her painted skin. Some said she wept in secret. Others said she laughed when her ring would not come off, even as it cut the skin and the flesh puffed purple around it like fruit left to rot. That ring, her coronation ring, worn since the first day of her reign, was more than a jewel. It was a seal, a promise, a prison. Removing it, she believed, would be the same as abdicating her fate, and so she let it stay. Even when the pain became unbearable, even when the royal physicians begged her to let it be cut away, eventually, it fused with her finger, flesh grown over metal, like ivy over ruin, and the wound beneath became the quiet epicenter of infection. But there was something else, more hidden, more insidious than even the lead and mercury. It was silence, a silence held by those around her, those who loved her or feared her, or both, who watched her change and said nothing. The court had grown used to pretending. They had pretended she was ageless. They had pretended she was untouched by grief, untouched by desire, untouched by loneliness. And now they pretended not to see her faltering steps, her gaze lost in empty space, the way she touched her crown less often, as though it had grown heavy. Fear held them. Fear of breaking the spell. Fear of revealing that the sun was setting on the Elizabethan age. And so the poison continued. Every cracked fingernail hidden beneath gold rings. Every trembling word smoothed into careful oration. Every cough dismissed as fatigue. Every stagger disguised as royal grace. She became a monument to denial. But even monument decay, even queens, painted to perfection, must one day look into the mirror and see the shadow behind the paint. And perhaps she did. Perhaps in the stillness of a darkened chamber, when no one else was near, Elizabeth touched her own face and wondered what remained beneath the mask. Perhaps she remembered being a girl, running in the gardens of Hatfield, hair wild and cheeks flushed, not from pigment, but from wind. Perhaps she longed for a moment to be simply a woman, not a legend. But by then, the legend was all that was left. And the legend was dying. Not in war, not in scandal, not even in betrayal, but in quiet, chemical surrender. She had built her kingdom from symbols, ruled by persona, commanded loyalty through myth. But the cost of myth is the body, and her body, faithful until the end, was now dissolving under the very image it had sustained. The crown remained on her head, but the poison had reached her heart, and it was there, in that silence, in that final winter, that the age began to end. It began as a symbol of devotion, a promise between a queen and her kingdom, a small circle of gold that shimmered beneath the candlelight on the day the crown was placed upon her head, in the year 1558. When Elizabeth Tudor became Elizabeth Regina, she received a coronation ring that symbolized the marriage of monarch to nation, the eternal bond between ruler and realm. She had sworn herself to England, to its land, its people, and to a destiny that allowed no room for husband or child. The ring, she said, was her wedding band, and she would wear it until death. And she did longer, perhaps, than even death had patience for. At first, it fit her perfectly. Her hands, slender and strong, were the hands of a woman who ruled through gesture and presence rather than sword. They signed decrees, received gifts, waved away threats. They were hands of power, hands of precision, but the years were unkind, and the body, no matter how divine the poets claimed it to be, could not remain untouched by time. The fingers thickened, the skin tightened, the veins rose like rivers under the pale surface. And yet the ring stayed. It stayed through winters and wars, through fever and victory, through betrayal and celebration. It stayed because removing it would have meant breaking the vow she had built her reign, upon that she belonged to no man, only to England. But the body does not understand symbolism. The body only knows flesh. And in the final years of her reign, the ring began to turn cruel. It was said that her hand swelled gradually, first from age, then from pain, then from something darker, a subtle infection, a sickness that started small, but spread like shadow under skin. Her attendants noticed her wincing when she signed her name. They saw how she favored her left hand. They saw how the ring, once gleaming, had dulled, the gold tarnished by sweat and blood. But they said nothing, for to mention her suffering was to trespass into sacred ground. The Queen's body was a temple, and temples are not questioned. Weeks passed, the pain deepened, the skin around the ring began to redden, blister, and throb. But Elizabeth, proud and unyielding, refused to remove it. Perhaps she saw it as an omen that to take it off would invite death, that the bond between her and England must remain sealed until her final breath. Or perhaps she simply could not bear to admit defeat, even to her own flesh. The infection spread beneath her gloves, hidden from the court's gaze. Her finger grew disfigured, The ring cut into it, carving a permanent ridge that deepened with every passing day. The wound became a circle of agony, a crown for a single finger. Physicians were called, though only in whispers. They advised removal. She refused. They tried to cool the swelling with vinegar cloths and rose water, to drain the inflammation with leeches and poultices. Nothing worked. The poison, whether from metal, blood, or vanity, had already entered her. And yet, she endured, because endurance was the last power she had left. The woman who had outlasted her father's shadow, her sister's wrath, the conspiracies of Catholics and Puritans alike, now found her enemy not in Spain or Rome, but in her own hand. And still, she would not yield. To remove the ring was to betray the image. She had become a monarch untouched by decay, unbroken by flesh. To confess pain was to be mortal. Here attendants, ever loyal, hid her suffering with silk gloves. They stitched them tight around the wrist, so that none might see the bulge beneath. But even gloves could not muffle the truth forever. Her movements grew slower. Her handwriting faltered. In meetings, she began to keep her right hand folded, resting it gently on her lap as if to cradle it. Those who noticed pretended they did not. The mask of youth had already begun to crumble. The crown could not bear another crack. It was said that in her final month, as the pain became unbearable, the ring began to fuse completely with the flesh, swallowed by the swelling, the skin sealing around it as though reclaiming what had once been borrowed. Gold and blood became one. And there, under the weight of lace and velvet, the Queen of England carried a wound that no one could touch, a secret that pulsed with every beat of her heart. Some chroniclers later claimed that it was only in her last week alive that the surgeons were finally permitted to act. The hand had turned purple. Fewa Hasidin. She had grown delirious, refusing to eat, refusing to sleep, whispering to unseen figures in the corners of her chamber. The physicians begged her to allow them to cut away the ring, for it was now a prison of infection, the entry point of death itself. She consented not as queen, but as woman. Tired and trembling, the ring was removed by force. When it came away, it took with it a layer of her flesh. The relief did not come, only exhaustion. She sat in silence, staring at her hand, the pale indent left behind a hollow circle that would never heal. In that moment, perhaps she saw it for what it truly was, not a symbol of devotion, but of sacrifice. For she had given her body to her kingdom, and now it was collecting the debt. In the days that followed, her fever worsened, her attendants kept the chamber dim, her body propped by pillows. The sound of her breathing filled the room, soft but uneven, like the rustle of silk dragged over stone. She muttered the names of those long dead, her mother, her father, her friends gone to dust, and once, it is said, she whispered something about the ring, that it had betrayed her, that it had kept her bound when she should have been free. No one answered. No one dared. And then, as if her body had finally decided that the bond between queen and country had run its course, she fell silent. The hand that had signed treaties, commanded armies, and held the sceptre of empire went limp. The ring that had marked her reign sat on the table beside her, small and unassuming, a simple circle of gold. Yet within that circle lay an entire story, the story of a woman who turned her devotion into imprisonment, her duty into disease, her crown into a cage. It is strange how the smallest things destroy us. Not the great battles, not the assassins in the dark, not even the whispers of treachery, but the quiet, intimate cruelties we carry in the name of faith, loyalty, love. Elizabeth's ring was all of these. It was beauty, it was pride, it was fear, and like the lead upon her skin, it was a poison she chose to keep. because to let it go would mean facing what lay beneath the mortal truth that even a queen, even one crowned in glory, could not rule her own body forever. And so, the legend of the ring became part of her myth, another symbol for poets to bend into metaphor, another secret for history to half believe. But for those who saw it, who watched her hand tremble, who cleaned the wound that would not heal, it was no metaphor. It was the quiet horror of witnessing power turn against itself. It was the sight of gold disappearing into flesh, and the unspoken understanding that this was how all empires end, not with war, but with weight. The ring had been her marriage to England, and England, like all lovers, had taken everything she had to give. In the last days of March, when the frost clung to the fields and the London sky turned the colour of dull pewter, the Queen stopped sleeping. It began with a single night of restlessness, then 2, then 3, until the candle by her bedside never went out, and the room became a place of eternal dusk. Her maids tried to coax her into bed, whispering prayers, offering wine mixed with valerian, reading softly from the psalms she once loved as a girl. But she only shook her head. She would not lie down. She could not. The moment she closed her eyes, she said, she saw things, faces half remembered, hands reaching from the corners of the chamber, a crown hovering above her head like a halo of fire. To sleep was to surrender, and surrender was death. For more than 40 years, she had ruled without kneeling to any man, without yielding to any fear, but one, the fear of being still. To lie down was to become still, and to become still was to invite the end she had outwitted again and again. Her might, once sharper than any blade in her kingdom, had begun to drift. Words slipped away mid-sentence. Names dissolved on her tongue. The women around her wept quietly when they thought she could not hear. For even in decay, she commanded silence. She had lost weight. The gowns that once fit like armor now hung loose, heavy and cold. Her skin, pale from years of lead paint and illness, had taken on a waxen sheen. The physicians who attended her timid men, more frightened of her temper than of the disease, spoke of melancholy, of vapours, of humours turned black by exhaustion. But the truth, unspoken, was that her body had simply had enough. It was unravelling from the inside, poisoned, inflamed, starved of sleep. And yet, every time they begged her to rest, she lifted her chin and answered with the same hoarse whisper, "When I lie down, I will rise no more." They tried to make her comfortable where she sat, pillows piled high around the throne-like chair near her window, blankets draped across her knees. The light through the glass painted her in gold and shadow, her face a mixture of saint and spectre. At times she dozed upright, her chin sinking to her chest, only to startle awake with a sharp gasp, muttering that someone had called her name. Sometimes she would speak to the empty air first softly, then in anger, then in tears. She would call for her cousin Mary, the one she had condemned, and then for her mother, whose head had fallen on a scaffold before she could even remember her voice. In those moments, the court held its breath, for no one knew whether the Queen spoke to ghosts or to the memory of herself. As the days passed, her voice grew weaker, but her will remained iron. She refused food, refused medicine, refused to undress. She would not be seen vulnerable. Her council gathered in hushed corridors, frightened not just for her, but of her. For even in this frailty she radiated command. When one of them, an old man whose loyalty had outlived reason, fell to his knees and begged her to eat, she turned her hollow eyes upon him and said, almost gently, "Must I still be fed like a child, when the crown itself is heavy enough to break my neck outside the palace walls?" The city whispered. Bells tolled without occasion. Markets slowed. Londoners spoke of omens, dogs howling at dawn. The river running thick and dark, a halo of light seen circling the moon. The Queen's sickness had become the nation's shadow. For decades, she had been the heart of England. The mother who needed no children. The sun that never set. And now that sun was flickering, the court musicians played softer. The corridors grew colder. The kingdom waited for a sound, the fall of a crown. A single breath, ending an era. Inside her chamber, the fire burned low. Her maids took turns fanning her, wiping the sweat that gathered along her hairline. When they begged her again to lie down, she only said, "You do not understand. If I close my eyes, I will see the truth. I will see what waits behind the paint." One of them, braver than the rest, whispered that perhaps it was time to stop fearing truth. The Queen stared at her for a long while, then smiled. The faintest curve of cracked lips. "My dear," she murmured, "truth is for those who are ready to lose everything." That night, the chapel bells rang for the evening prayer. Though none dared leave her side, she sat as always, back straight, hands folded, eyes fixed on the window where dusk melted into darkness. Outside, the first stars appeared, and she watched them without blinking, as if memorizing their order before leaving the world. Hours passed, one by one. Her attendants nodded off where they knelt. But the Queen remained motionless. Only when the sky paled again did her head begin to droop. A sigh escaped her, a sound so soft that it could have been mistaken for wind slipping through the curtains. She slept for the first time in days. When she woke, her voice was different, thinner, slower, drifting between coherence and dream. She asked whether the Archbishop had come. She asked whether it was Sunday. She asked whether the sea was calm. Her maids did not know how to answer. They only nodded and wept. The council met once more, desperate to name a successor before the breath left her body. They whispered of James of Scotland, of stability, of continuity. But Elizabeth, hearing the murmurs through the door, turned her face away. She would not name him. She had never met him. To speak his name aloud was to admit the world could continue without her. And that, above all, she could not bear. On the final night, she asked for the room to be emptied. Only one lady remained, the one who had served her since youth. The Queen asked for her mirror. The woman hesitated, for the mirrors had been covered since the day the Queen had declared them liars. But she obeyed. She lifted the veil from the glass and placed it before her. Elizabeth stared. What she saw was not the painted goddess of portraits, not the radiant monarch of myth, but a woman frail, scarred, trembling, her once fiery hair now thin as smoke. For a long time she said nothing. Then she reached up and touched her own cheek, tracing the cracks where the paint had eaten into the flesh. "So this," she whispered, "is what remains." Her hand fell. The mirror was taken away. She did not ask for it again. When dawn came, she was still upright. Though barely conscious, the lady who sat beside her held her hand, feeling the faint pulse weaken. The Queen's lips moved, but no words emerged. Only one breath, drawn deep and released slowly, as if she were finally exhaling all the years she had kept trapped beneath the mask. And then stillness. The courtiers entered quietly, their faces pale. The physicians bowed their heads. Someone reached to lower her body, but the air seemed to hold her in place. Reach it even in death. For days, she had refused to lie down, and in that final defiance, she remained upright. A figure of will beyond reason, a statue made of pride and sorrow. They say that when the news spread through London, a hush fell across the city, unlike any silence before or since. Even the river seemed to slow. Church bells rang, not in triumph, but in mourning, their echoes carrying the weight of 44 years of rule. And though her crown was soon removed and her body laid to rest, The image endured of a woman who would not bow, not even to death itself. In that final act of refusal, Elizabeth became more than queen. She became myth once more. She turned fear into ritual, exhaustion into endurance, and mortality into legend. And perhaps that was her last lesson to the world, that power does not lie in the denial of death, but in the performance of defiance, because long after her body was gone, her ghost remained, standing unbent, unbroken. Forever awake beneath the heavy weight of the crown, she refused to set down. The queen was gone. Yet the silence she left behind seemed to breathe. Her attendants, stunned by the stillness, lingered in the room where she had sat for so many sleepless nights. The air was heavy with the scent of dying roses and the faint trace of lead that clung to her skin. Outside, the world already stirred with the machinery of succession. Courtiers who had wept at dawn were writing letters by noon. Messengers galloped down the thawing roads towards Scotland to summon a new king. But inside the chamber of the dead, time had stopped. The body of Queen Elizabeth still sat upright, rigid as marble, her eyes closed, but her face unyielding, as though the will that had ruled a nation refused to let the flesh sag into rest. When they finally laid her down, there was resistance, as if even death struggled to bend her. Her limbs were stiff, her hands curled around the rosary beads that had slipped between her fingers. Her coronation ring, that small circle of gold that had once merged with her flesh, lay on a nearby table, wrapped in a strip of cloth. No one dared put it back. It was over. And yet, the attendants could not shake the feeling that she was still watching. Even without breath, the queen commanded the room. Her pale face, powdered and perfect, looked less like a corpse and more like a statue consecrated to eternity. Preparations for embalming began that same night. The royal physicians worked under torchlight, their shadows moving across the walls like grim attendants of some sacred ritual. The queen's body was stripped of its garments, and for the first time in half a century, her skin was bare before the world. What they found beneath the paint and the lace made even the most hardened surgeon falter. Her flesh was ashen, her veins a faint blue map beneath the surface, her hair thin and yellowed from years of mercury and oil. Around her mouth, a faint ring of discoloration marked where the lead paint had eaten through the skin. Her shoulders bore the scars of corsets pulled too tight. Her hands, once admired for their grace, were twisted, the fingers swollen from the poison that had lived in her blood, and yet she did not smell of death. The attendants, experienced in such things, expected the sweetness of decay, that first whisper of what lies beyond the living. But there was nothing, only perfume, lavender, rose, a hint of the oils she had worn until her last day. It was said that her body remained strangely firm, almost waxen, as if the lead had not only destroyed her in life but preserved her in death. The physicians began their work cautiously, draining the fluids, washing the skin in wine and myrrh, binding the limbs in linen, soaked in balsam and spices. As they worked, the torches flickered. One man swore later that the queen's lips moved, that he saw them part slightly as if to speak. He was told to say nothing. When the embalming was finished, the body was dressed again in regal splendor, a gown of white satin trimmed with pearls, the ruff starched to perfection, jewels placed at her ears and throat. Her hair was arranged to hide the bald patches, her face repainted in the same white ceruse that had killed her. The irony was not lost on anyone present that even in death, she wore the poison like a crown. It was said that her cheeks glowed faintly, that the candlelight found in her skin a sheen, almost metallic, unnatural, unholy. And so the legend began. For the following days, her coffin remained sealed in the palace, watched by guards who reported strange sounds from within. They claimed to hear faint creaks, as if the wood had shifted. And once, late at night, a sigh. It may have been the settling of gases, the natural work of decomposition. But rumours do not wait for reason. Whispers spread through the servants' quarters, through the kitchens, through the streets beyond the palace gates. The queen's body does not rot. Some said the poisons in her veins had made her incorruptible, that she was too steeped in lead to decay. Others said the Virgin Queen had been half divine all along, and that even death dared not claim her fully. By the 7th day, when the coffin was prepared for transport to Westminster, the chamber was thick with unease. The carpenters sealed it with pitch, but still the perfume of roses and vinegar lingered in the air. As the men lifted it, one of them stumbled, swearing that it felt warm to the touch. His partner hissed for silence. They carried her out by torchlight, the procession moving like a ghostly river through the palace corridors. Behind them followed the ladies of her bedchamber, faces veiled, hands trembling. Some wept, some crossed themselves, some simply stared, as if unable to reconcile the grandeur of what they saw with the terror of what it meant. The coffin was placed in a private chamber until the official ceremonies could begin. Guards were stationed in shifts, but on the 3rd night, something happened that would feed whispers for generations. One of the guards, young, sleepless, unnerved by the long hours, reported hearing a faint crack from within the coffin, followed by a sound like sighing air. When he pressed his ear against the wood, he swore. He heard a noise like a breath escaping. He fled his post and refused to return. By morning, the story had spread through every corner of Whitehall. The Queen's body was alive. The courtiers laughed in public and whispered in private. The physicians denied it, but none volunteered to open the coffin to prove otherwise. When the funeral procession finally began, the city fell into mourning. Bells rang from dawn to dusk. Streets were draped in black. Her coffin, covered in cloth embroidered with the Tudor rose, was drawn by 4 horses through the weeping crowds. It was early April, the season when England should have been waking to spring, yet the sky was grey, the air heavy, and the river ran slow, as if burdened by grief. The people cried out her name as she passed. Though few could see her face, it had been sealed away, locked in that box that everyone now feared to touch. After the funeral, when her body was taken to Westminster Abbey to lie beside her half-sister Mary, the final preparations were made for burial. But before the stone was laid, one of the embalmers, curious, against orders, unfastened a section of the coffin lid to take one last look. He would later tell a priest that the sight turned his blood to ice. The Queen's face, he claimed, was unchanged. The skin was pale, but not shriveled. The lips were still red. The eyes, though closed, seemed to rest beneath the lids, as if she were dreaming. And, most dreadful of all, a faint scent of lead still hung in the air, sharp and metallic, as if the very poison that had consumed her in life was now embalming her from within. He closed the lid and told no one else until years later, when the story had already turned into legend. They said her body would not rot. They said the lead in her blood had turned her to stone. They said she was immortal, at least in part, and perhaps, in a way, she was. Because Elizabeth had always lived halfway between human and myth, between flesh and symbol, between body and story, in life, she had painted herself into an icon. In death, she remained one. Her body, locked in that coffin beneath layers of poison, perfume, and prayer, became an emblem of the age itself, a body preserved not by grace, but by vanity, by empire, by the strange alchemy of power and fear. Centuries later, when the vaults beneath Westminster were opened for restoration, workers claimed that her coffin emitted a faint metallic odour, unlike any other buried nearby. They did not open it. They did not dare. The lead still holds her. Even now, the Queen who would not decay, the queen who made death wait, because when you fill your veins with eternity, it stays. Even when you are gone. The church was silent, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was the kind that feels heavy, the kind that presses down on the lungs and makes even the air seem afraid to move. The torches burned low along the stone walls of Westminster Abbey, and the shadows seemed to shiver with each flicker of light. The Queen had been laid in state for several days, her coffin sealed in black velvet, guarded by men who would not speak of what they saw, or of what they thought they heard. During those long hours, when the world seemed to hold its breath, outside, England wept. Inside, something began to stir. The coffin itself was a work of art, lined with lead to preserve the body, adorned with the Tudor rose, and sealed so tightly that not even air could slip between the joints. It had been placed in the Abbey's great hall beneath the towering arches, surrounded by flickering candles that threw halos of trembling light onto the carved angels above. Every night, the guards took turns, keeping watch. It was said that even in death, no one trusted the quiet. Some claimed that the Queen's attendants still felt her presence, that they could hear her voice in their dreams, that her perfume lingered in the corridors, that her shadow passed by them in the half-dark. Others said the coffin itself made sounds, soft creaks, muffled thuds, the faintest echo of something shifting within. They told themselves it was nothing more than wood and air, but in their hearts, none believed it. The first sign came on the third night. The guard standing closest to the coffin reported that one of the candles flickered violently, though there was no draught. He swore he heard a noise, a hollow pop, faint but unmistakable. Then another, sharper this time, followed by a long sighing sound, as though the coffin itself had exhaled. The other guards dismissed it, telling him the wood was settling, that it was only the natural shifting of the materials. But the man who heard it did not sleep again that night. The next morning, when the priests entered for prayer, they found him pale and trembling, staring at the coffin, as though afraid it might move. By the fifth night, the hall was filled with mourners, lords, bishops, ladies of the court, all gathered for the final vigil before burial. The air was thick with incense, rosewater, and grief. Hymns were sung softly. Candles dripped wax onto the floor, and every so often, a muffled sob echoed through the vaulted space. The Queen lay before them, her coffin gleaming in the light, her name carved in gold. And then, sometime after midnight, when the prayers had fallen to murmurs and the Abbey's stones had grown cold, the impossible happened. It began with a crack. A small one, barely audible, like the snap of a twig underfoot. Then another, louder. The air in the room changed. Someone said later that it felt heavier, almost electric, as though lightning had passed through the stones themselves. One of the candles nearest the coffin sputtered out. The shadows deepened, and then there was a sound that no one present would ever forget. A deep, muffled burst, followed by a rush of air so sudden that several candles went out at once. The women screamed. The priests dropped to their knees. For a moment, no one moved. The coffin had split. A thin line appeared along one of its seams, glistening with something dark. The smell that followed was like nothing any of them had known before, sweet and metallic, sharp as vinegar and sickly as decay. The guard stepped forward, uncertain whether to approach or flee. The bishop shouted for them to open the doors, to let in air, for the room had begun to fill with smoke or mist, though none could tell from where it came. In the confusion, one of the attendants swore he saw movement, a tremor, a shifting shape within the coffin, as though the Queen herself had stirred in protest. It was over in moments, but the panic it caused lingered for years. The physicians, when summoned the next morning, offered a simple explanation. The lead-lined coffin had been sealed too tightly. The heat of candles, the natural gases of decay. The chemicals used in embalming all had built pressure within until the structure could no longer contain it. The body, saturated with substances far from natural lead, mercury, balsam, wine, and rose oil, had reacted in a way no one could have foreseen. It had expanded. It had ruptured. It had, quite literally, exploded. The sound, they said, was the coffin giving way. Nothing more, but those who had been there would never believe it was only that. They whispered that her body had rejected death, that the queen who had refused to lie down, who had defied sleep and decay alike, had continued her rebellion, even in the tomb. They said that the air in the abbey was haunted for months after, that the smell never truly left, that servants found fine flakes of white dust clinging to the altar cloths, glittering faintly in the morning sun. Some said it was lead. Some said it was ash. And a few swore it was the powder from her own face. Ceruse turned to dust and carried by the air, as if her vanity had finally escaped its vessel. The clergy did their best to cleanse the place. They scrubbed the floors, relit the candles, prayed over the stone. But the legend had already taken root. Word spread quickly beyond the abbey walls. In taverns and marketplaces, people whispered that the queen's spirit had risen from her coffin in anger, that her body had burst as a sign from heaven. Others said it was punishment for her sins, her pride, her vanity, her refusal to wed, and still others, more reverent, claimed it was proof of her divinity that no mortal vessel could contain her. The court tried to silence the rumors, but they grew with every retelling. By the time her coffin was finally sealed again, with extra bands of iron and a fresh layer of lead, the story had already become something else entirely. She was no longer a dead queen. She was a legend of transformation. A woman who had turned her body into a weapon, her death into a warning, her decay into spectacle. And perhaps, in some strange way, that is exactly what she would have wanted. For even in death, Elizabeth I was a performer. Every gesture, every speech, every mask she had worn was a kind of theatre. She understood the power of image better than anyone of her time. And if her final act was to explode from her coffin, if her last gesture was to break the boundaries of flesh and container alike, then it was the ultimate expression of who she had always been. A woman too vast, too fierce, too burdened with myth to remain enclosed. The explosion was not just the end of a body, it was the sound of an age collapsing, the breath of an era leaving the world. The Tudor dynasty, once brilliant and burning, was gone. The light that had held England together through faith and fear had finally gone out. But the echoes remained. In the dark corners of Westminster Abbey, where her body still lies, entombed beside her half-sister Mary. Some say you can still hear the faintest hum on quiet nights, a soft, almost inaudible vibration, like the memory of that final burst, the sigh of lead expanding against stone. And when the candles flicker for no reason, when a trace of perfume lingers where no flowers have been placed, when the silence in the abbey grows too deep to bear, they say it is her reminding the living that she has not entirely gone. Because how could she be the queen who painted herself to death? The woman who refused to lie down, the body that would not rot, the corpse that could not contain itself. Elizabeth Tudor had conquered everything but the truth of mortality, and even then, she made it bow to her, if only for a moment, before breaking free. When the smoke of Elizabeth's funeral candles finally faded from Westminster, and the crown passed quietly into another line, her image did not die with her. It spread, like perfume on a warm wind, invisible but intoxicating, seeping into the very pores of England. The Virgin Queen was gone. Yet her ghost lingered, not in the halls of power, but in the mirrors of women who would never meet her, women who had inherited her fear without her throne, her hunger for perfection without her kingdom to justify it. For what Elizabeth had created in her own reflection was not simply an icon, it was a template, and those who came after would follow it into the same fire. In the years after her death, her portraits continued to hang in parlours and chapels. The paint untouched, the faces luminous. Children were told stories of her courage, her wit, her victory over the Armada, her refusal to bow to any man. But no one spoke of the trembling hands, the swelling fingers, the nights without sleep. No one spoke of the lead that had eaten her alive. They remembered her as the queen who ruled through beauty, not the woman who was consumed by it. And so, across England, the poison lived on. Noble women began to paint themselves in imitation of her ghost. The pale face, the red lips, the stillness, those became the hallmarks of grace. The more fragile one looked, the closer one was to virtue. Lead-based powders were sold in apothecaries under names like Venetian Snow and Queen's Light. They promised purity, dignity, and love. No one asked what they cost. No one cared. To be admired was worth the risk. The same recipe that had killed a monarch became the secret ritual of her descendants. And so, slowly, silently, a new plague began. Not of disease, but of vanity. Women rubbed lead into their cheeks, mercury into their eyes, and smiled through the pain as their skin burned beneath the paint. Some fainted at banquets. Some went blind. Some lost their teeth, their hair, their lives. But they looked beautiful as they did it. And that was all that mattered. The Queen had done it first, and so it must have been holy. In the great houses of London, beauty became a kind of worship. Mirrors were hung like altars. Cosmetics were the new sacraments. Women competed not in kindness or knowledge, but in how much suffering they could conceal behind their painted masks. And the men who praised them never noticed the tremor in their hands, the powder on their collars, the faint metallic scent of death that followed them through the corridors. They only saw the illusion and illusions, as Elizabeth had once known, are far easier to rule than flesh. The poorer women followed in their own way. They could not afford ceruse, but they mixed chalk and vinegar, flour and ash, until they too could mimic the ghostly whiteness of the court. In villages, in markets, even in the fields, the cult of the pale face spread. The same land that had buried its queen now buried countless nameless women who had tried to wear her crown in miniature. Their deaths were not recorded. Their suffering was not painted, but they carried her legacy in their blood. It was not just the poison that endured. It was the idea, the belief that beauty was power. That control of the body was control of destiny. That to be loved, to be respected, to be safe, one must first be perfect. It was the curse Elizabeth had forged in her mirror and passed down like a birthright. Century later, when lead was finally outlawed from cosmetics, the poisons merely changed form. Arsenic replaced it, then mercury again, then chemicals with gentler names but the same old promise. And still the women obeyed. They burned their skin, starved their bodies, crushed their bones beneath whalebone corsets and steel hoops. They lived for mirrors. They died for approval. They whispered Elizabeth's story without speaking her name. Each of them a small echo of the queen who had painted herself to death. Even queens who came after her could not escape the reflection she left behind. In the glittering courts of Europe, monarchs and mistresses alike chased her ghost. Marie Antoinette, Century later, powdered her face in the same white haze, her hair piled high like a monument to control. In France, in Spain, in every royal court that still believed beauty meant divinity, women built their lives around appearances that could kill them. And when the guillotine came for Marie, her final act, a perfectly arranged bow, a calm face was an Elizabethan echo. The mask, once again, had outlived the woman, and it did not end with crowns. When the age of kings gave way to the age of cameras, the curse only deepened. The mirrors multiplied, the light changed shape, but the story remained the same. Women painted themselves to hide the cracks. Just as she had done, they smiled for portraits, for screens, for eyes that did not see them, but only the surface. They swallowed pills instead of lead. They carved their skin instead of painting it. They called it freedom. But the ghost of the Virgin Queen still whispered in every gesture, "Be perfect, or be forgotten." Perhaps Elizabeth did not mean to curse them. Perhaps she only wanted to survive. To stand in a world that had killed her mother, her cousins, her rivals, and to prove that she alone could remain untouched. In her own way, it was an act of rebellion to claim the right to her image, to her story, to her body. But somewhere along the line, rebellion became ritual, and ritual became ruin. There is a strange cruelty in how her myth endured. Men of history praised her for her intellect, her politics, her command of the age. But what the world remembered, most of all, was her face, her whiteness, her mask. Even now, Centurilateur. Her portraits hang in museums, glowing like ghosts in gilded frames. Her skin luminous, her eyes remote. Visitors stand before them in awe, never realizing they are staring at the aftermath of poison. They call her beautiful. They call her eternal. And in a way, she is, because beauty, when wielded as weapon, does not die. It replicates. It finds new faces to wear, new hearts to corrupt, new generations to burn from the inside out. And somewhere, beneath all the powders and perfumes of the modern age, her legacy still lingers the idea that control must come through suffering, that worth must be proven through pain, that silence and composure are stronger than truth. The women who followed her may no longer wear crowns or corsets, but they still carry the same invisible ring, still bleed from the same invisible wound. They too smile when it hurts. They too refuse to lie down. And perhaps, in this quiet persistence, there is a kind of kinship, not of poison, but of endurance. The same fire that destroyed her has kept them alive. For all the cruelty she embodied, Elizabeth also embodied defiance. The defiance to rise when told to bow, to rule when told to marry, to create herself in a world that would have unmade her. She burned for it. They all did. And they still do. So when you pass a mirror and you catch yourself adjusting, straightening, correcting. I remember the Queen who once stood before her own reflection in candlelight, whispering to the ghost behind the glass, "Remember that beauty has always been a battlefield, that the war she began has never truly ended, that her story was not only about poison, but about survival." For Elizabeth's fire did not die in Westminster. It scattered, and it burns quietly, endlessly, in the hearts of those who follow her still. The night is quiet now. The torches that once burned for queens have turned to dust, and the soft hum of centuries rests over the old stones of Westminster like a lullaby. Somewhere far beneath the echo of the Abbey's vaulted ceiling lies a coffin sealed in lead. The air within heavy, with the memory of roses and poison above it. The world hums with a different kind of noise. Carriages replaced by cars. Candles by screens. Yet the mirror, ever faithful, has not changed. It waits, as it has always waited, to ask the same question that destroyed a queen. What will you give to be seen? There is something painfully human in Elizabeth's story. Something that hums beneath the grandeur of her crown and the terror of her mask. It is not only the story of a monarch, nor of vanity, nor even of power. It is the story of the ancient bargain every woman learns to make in her own quiet way, the bargain between who she is and what the world demands. She appeared to be The queen simply made hers on a larger stage, painted in brighter colors, recorded in gold leaf and lead dust. Her reflection, caught forever in portraits that refuse to age, became the mirror in which every woman since has, at least once, seen a flicker of herself. She wanted to be eternal, and in a way, she succeeded. But eternity is a cruel companion, one that feeds on the body while it preserves the image. Beneath her powder, beneath the layers of silk, and the fortress of her ruff, she was crumbling. The very substances that gave her radiance were eating her alive, and yet she persisted, because she could not do otherwise. To remove the mask would have been to unmake the myth. To let the world see the human beneath the divinity would have been to admit that the Virgin Queen was only flesh after all. And flesh, as she knew too well, is mortal. Flesh ends. So she chose instead to become the portrait, frozen, flawless, distant until her body could no longer bear the lie. But what is beauty, really, if not a kind of prayer whispered to time, a plea to be spared, if only for a moment, from decay? The queen prayed with lead. The women who came after her prayed with lace, and corsets, and silence. Today, the prayer takes other forms: bright lights, painted screens, the endless pursuit of perfection that glows cold and blue through the long nights. But the words are the same. See me. Remember me. Don't let me fade. Elizabeth's tragedy was not in her death. It was in her belief that to be loved, she had to remain untouchable. To be powerful, she had to become inhuman. To be remembered, she had to stop changing. And so she became what all great myths become. In the end, something too perfect to be alive, too fragile to be real. She transformed herself into a symbol, and the world applauded, not realizing that every bow they gave her was also a burial. There is a strange symmetry in how she ruled. She governed her kingdom as she governed her reflection, with discipline, with fear, with ceremony. She tolerated no rebellion, not in her court and not in her face. The cracks, when they came, were filled with powder. The pain was disguised as composure. Even in her final hours, she refused to surrender the performance. When her body cried out for rest, she remained upright. When her skin burned, she painted it white. When her heart failed, she smiled. That smile tight, painted, resolute was her crown as much as any jewel. But if history is kind, it is because it knows irony well. The queen who tried so hard to outwit decay ended up preserved by it. Her lead-filled body, embalmed in poison, resisted rot. The same chemicals that killed her made her incorruptible. In death, she became what she had always wanted to be: unchanging. The mirror had won. And yet, her story is not just a warning. It is a reminder of how easily survival can become obsession, how quickly power can turn into prison. Elizabeth did what she had to do to rule in a world that never wanted her to. She weaponized beauty, because beauty was the only armor the world allowed her. And while it destroyed her, it also saved her. Her mask was not merely vanity, it was defiance. It said, "I am still here. I will not vanish. I will not kneel." Perhaps that is why her ghost lingers. Not out of torment, but out of pride. The lead may have bound her flesh, but it could not bind her will. The halls she once walked still carry her echo, the rustle of her gowns, the whisper of her voice when she told a trembling ambassador that she had the heart and stomach of a king. She remains, not as she was, but as she wished to be: radiant, indestructible, eternal. And yet, the price of such radiance is steep. For every woman who has ever starved herself for the gaze of another, for every hand that has trembled over the mirror, for every heart that has measured worth in reflection, the Queen's ghost stands quietly nearby, not to mock, but to remind that beauty, when bought with suffering, does not make one divine. It makes one haunted. That control, when carried too far, becomes its own kind of decay, and that even the most powerful woman in the world could not escape the simplest truth of all that to be loved. One must first be alive. So tonight, if you find yourself staring into the mirror longer than you mean to, searching for flaws, chasing perfection, whisper to your reflection what Elizabeth never could. Tell it that it is enough. Tell it that beauty is not in the mask, but in the breath that fogs the glass. Tell it that the body does not owe the world a performance. And if you listen carefully, perhaps you'll hear a faint sound in return, not the explosion of a coffin, not the sigh of poison, but a soft, tired exhale, as if somewhere deep within history, the Queen herself has finally laid down her crown. Because all the paint in the world cannot make immortality kind, and all the power in the world cannot make beauty free. What remains, when the mirrors crack and the portraits fade, is the thing she feared most: humanity. Soft, flawed, mortal, miraculous. The thing she spent her life burying beneath layers of white. The thing that outlived her anyway.